Welcome to SUSECON 2022, the session TUT 1071. My name is Zhou, the Senior Engineering Manager of SUSE Linux Enterprise High Availability Product. In this session, I'm going to share the coming release 15SP4, how the new feature help our users to simplify HA cluster bootstrap and shutdown. And let's get into the session. So agenda of this session, first, I'm going to share the feature to improve user interface and the user experience over years for this SLE-15 SP4 release. And second, I will give an example scenario to set up a cluster. And third, basically to illustrate the details behind the scene. And fourth, just to give a future to-do list or wish list. SLE-15 SP4 is a continuous effort over years to improve user interface and the user experience. In this release, our HR product simplify the initial setup by using the predefined bootstrap profiles. Another feature is regarding to the Graceful shutdown. The Serum shall add additional new options --all. It's intended to improve the diskless SBD cluster and the DRM cluster. And the OCFS part, we add the new options, no cluster mount options, basically allow users to mount local file system without running cluster stack. Pacemaker side, it supports OCF 1.1 standard. And the CoreSync, it adds resilience to cope with the public cloud package inspection hiccup, for example. Now, let me share the one example scenario. It basically to set up the cluster file system. So for this scenario, we basically use a 2-node and a shared storage. In the past, to do this, I prepared a backlog in the past. I will need several pages to make this setup. Basically, you can imagine the cluster stack contains various components from pacemaker configuration down to the CoreSync, SBD configuration, and also the shared storage LVM and the OCF, and all those components has interaction and has some tricky parameters need to be prepared to make sure the production environment are working well, especially in those failure situations. So now, in this coming new release, SLE-HA 15SP4, we can do this in a pretty simple command, just like in the slides. Some annotation about those commands. Dash big C indicate to use LVM based cluster LVM for OCFS2. And for some users who familiar with our product, just a side note, -u options is no longer needed now. Since Serum Shell Bootstrap by default applies UDP protocol for Coruscant. So that's basically the example scenario. So getting to the details, how we improve the bootstrapping. First, let me mention about for the cluster to use LVM, we must prevent LVM auto activation during the OS boot. And basically we'll leave the LVM activation later to the cluster stack. If the cluster uses a shared volume group, by nature, this volume group cannot be activated without the cluster stack. So that's good. That's fit what the design. And if we are using the normal traditional active passive LVM setup, so if we are using the specified uh, system ID volume for the system to prevent them get activated during the OS boot, LVM activate resource agent leverages a new options at the LVM level. So the new options dash set auto activation options basically will skip the auto activation at the by the LVM scan itself. So it defers LVM activation operation to the pacemaker stack. And Serum shall also set no quorum policy to freeze. This is a general advice from DRM cluster. Basically, it avoids the stop failure to cause the node reset. And during the bootstrap, Serum Shell has a predefined cluster configuration in the etc Serum Shell profiles YAML files. This predefined configuration can let users deploy the cluster in a different situation, in a different setup, and our Bootstrap tools, Shell, will based on the predefined profile to pick up the different parameters. For example, the typical cluster in Microsoft Azure, the Coruscant totem timeout will be set to 30 seconds, and the watchdog timeout will be set to 60 seconds. Those parameters is intended to design the public cloud operation hiccup, those maintenance window, uh, to avoid unexpected behavior of a cluster. And if our cluster using the disk-based SBD to set up the cluster, so Serum Shell Bootstrap will check watchdogs and will configure and mode probe the softdog driver during the OS boot if need. This basically is an intention to avoid the misconfiguration if some users just forgot. And Serum Shell also set pacemaker delay maximum to 30 seconds if the cluster is 2 node without Q device. SHRM shall also ensure the determinate state of the Stoney's operation of the cluster and make sure Stoney's timeout is bigger than the pacemaker delay maximum plus the corresponding plus the SBD configuration of message wait. To prevent fence failure to trigger double fencing, SHRM shall make sure Stoney's timeout is bigger than the corresponding token and consensus. Now let's look at this even further. A cluster with a disk-based SBD in a virtual machine environment, like in KVM, like in Zen or VMware or Hyper-V, to avoid the node return to the cluster too fast and too quickly. Often there will be a critical message like we will allege just fenced by someone. So to avoid that, SRM shell bootstrap will make sure SBD delay start parameters in SBD configuration. Make sure it is bigger than the corresponding token timeout plus consensus timeout, and plus the pacemaker configuration of pacemaker delay maximum plus SBD message wait. So here is a very typical situation. You can imagine the complexity among different components. So we need to cooperate together. And even more, ShamShell will try to avoid system give up starting SBD surveys in the beginning. So it will adjust timeout start second of the SBD surveys file to make sure it is bigger than SBD delay start of SBD. Look at the situation. The cluster set up with a diskless SBD use case. So ShamShell will make sure the Stoney's timeout, which is a pacemaker property, it makes sure it is bigger than the Stoney's watchdog timeout. Stoney's watchdog timeout usually it's at 2 times of SBD watchdog timeout. If it is a virtualization environment, ShamShell Bootstrap will make sure SBD delay start is bigger than the corresponding token plus consensus timeout plus 2 times SBD watchdog timeout. And now those are complexity improvement in the Bootstrap. Now we're getting to the another major improvement of CRM shell shutdown. So to improve the cluster Graceful shutdown procedure. Let's get into this, some details. CRM shell Bootstrap scripts the functionality add --all new options. Now it basically stops pacemaker first at all nodes. After that, the corresponding bootstrap stop corresponding at all nodes. This is the intention to solve two problems of the cluster shutdown if we shut down them one by one node. In that case, once the node get lost quorum, in the first situation of a diskless SBD clusters, the SBD will trigger self-fence by design. If it is a DRM clusters, a DRM will harm, and basically it prevents shutdown. To shut down the DRM clusters, furthermore, DRM tools implement a brand new options, set config options, and Serum Shell bootstrap functionality leverage these options and to shut down the hanging DRM in the above situation. So, those details behavior now is not necessary to uh, involve the user to know the details and make a much better user experience to deal with a special situation for the sysadmin. Yes, that's primarily all the details of today. But last, I still want to share some of our future to-do list to continue improve the user interface and the user experience. For example, uh, for the cluster of two node, often the priority fence delay feature is handy to make sure the cluster primary cluster to stay alive in a speed sprint situation. So bootstrap scripts, um, it'll be handy to prepare this new feature in the beginning. And second, Serum Shell functionalities would like to gradually start the very large clusters, basically to avoid a hiccup of the cluster startup if all those nodes start all together. Meanwhile, we are going to improve the bootstrap of performance, basically by isolating SUSECON 2 from the normal bootstrapping procedure. We are foreseeing a noticeable bootstrapping performance improvement. Anyway, looking forward to your feedback, and thank you to engage and let's enjoy the new release. Thank you. Bye bye.